Returned from my visit to Indonesia and Singapore, a visit that has reinforced the importance of Asia to the future of New Zealand. As you know, increasing our trade and investment with the rest of the world is an important part of the government's plan to build a more productive economy. We need to earn our way in the world. Indonesia is potentially a huge market and important business partner for New Zealand. It's the fourth most populated country in the world and it's our nearest Asian neighbour. Indonesia has just this year ratified the ASEAN Australia and New Zealand FTA, and as a country we need to make the most of this agreement just as we're doing with other Asian countries including China. I took a delegation of business leaders with me who found the trip to be very worthwhile. During the visit, Auckland Airport signed an MOU with the airline Garuda, which is an important step towards a direct service between Indonesia and New Zealand. And Fonterra announced it will be opening its first processing plant in Indonesia. At a government-to-government level, we signed off on a program of cooperation in geothermal energy, of which Indonesia has huge untapped reserves. The government will also be appointing a trade commissioner to Jakarta. This is a new position and will add impetus to the job of building business links between Indonesia and New Zealand. My ministers have also been busy during the recess pushing New Zealand's inks case in many countries. Deputy Prime Minister Bill English led New Zealand's ministerial delegation to the Australian-New Zealand Leadership Forum in Sydney a couple of weeks ago. Stephen Joyce, Murray McCulley, Tim Grosser and Craig Foss were all there. You'll know that the next year is the 30th anniversary of CER, a world-leading free trade agreement, and we're keen to take our already close relationship with Australia in this respect to either further heights. The feedback from the forum was particularly positive. Australian business leaders admire New Zealand's encouraging economic policy settings, and some are already moving jobs to New Zealand, recognising our competitive advantages around general economic policy direction, the exchange rate, regulations and tax. There has to be positive for jobs and incomes on the side of the Tasman. Stephen Joyce also travelled to Oman, Qatar and Saudi Arabia to raise New Zealand's profile as a destination for international students and to support education companies seeking to grow their businesses in the region. Tim Grosser, meanwhile, led a trade mission of 14 companies to Chongqing in inland China and subsequently attended the G20 trade ministers meeting in Mexico. This is a rare honour and recognises Tim's very strong reputation on the international stage. So all this demonstrates this government's commitment to building on our strong trade and investment ties around the world so we can deliver more jobs and higher incomes to New Zealanders. In terms of ministerial activity, tomorrow I'll be in New Plymouth. On Wednesday I'll attend the Anzac Dawn service in Auckland, then I'll attend the national service here at the War Memorial in Wellington. On Thursday I'm in the southern part of the Northland electorate, and on Friday I have visits in Christchurch. On Saturday and Sunday I'll be attending the National Party Mainland Conference in Dunedin. Questions?
Did you expect to get the support of John Baggs and Peter Dunn for any legislative change that you'd need through this deal to consent?
Well, I haven't had any direct discussions with them about it, but they will obviously want to look at the deal, but my expectation is yes, they'll support it.
Why haven't you spoken to them about it in principle?
Oh, well, look, I don't remember having conversations with them. I think at the end of the day we'll be wanting to present the deal to them, but you know, my sense is if we can conclude a deal, then they will see the same benefits that many New Zealanders will see, which is more jobs, better opportunities for our young people, a good environment to be operating in, and 200,000 extra visitor nights coming from overseas. And I think all of those things make that deal pretty compelling. As we know, the deal is unlikely to require taxpayer funds or us running the convention centre. Again, I think they're all positives.
You don't expect any problems from them?
Well, I haven't had, from memory, I can't remember having any detailed discussions with them, but no, I wouldn't expect problems. I mean, providing we can get a deal concluded with Skycity, which is logical. I mean, that's been the process of negotiation now with officials and the Minister of MED's office for some time. Obviously, we're working hard to make sure it's a good deal for taxpayers, can't just be a good deal for Skycity. If that's the case, then hopefully we'll get there.
Is it far
I think it's getting closer, last time I asked.
What do you mean by getting closer? Weeks or?
Don't know exactly. I mean, as the Minister said yesterday, he's always reluctant to put a date on these things because it weakens the government's negotiating end.
You say unlikely to require taxpayer funds. I thought it couldn't require taxpayer funds for the government to go ahead with it.
Well, there's always a range of options, but our preferred option is we don't have to put taxpayer funds in.
You still will go ahead with it if there is a requirement for taxpayer funds?
Well, let's wait and see. My preferred option is we don't have to put taxpayer funds in.
Isn't it odd that you haven't done a study at all on any social impact or harm from increasing the number of paper machines in Skycity to weigh that up against the economic benefits that you say would come from any deal.
We've done a feasibility study on the overall economic benefits of a convention centre, and what that showed was that there are real benefits for the region and for the country, but they're not all captured in one place, which is the convention centre, and that's the reason why these things never generally wash their face, and that's what we've seen around the world. In terms of pokie machines and the impact of that, well, the good news part of this story is there'll be less pokie machines in New Zealand, not more, so the economic or social impact is less impact, not more impact.
But there's going to be fewer pokie machines anyway, because I mean they're
That's
coming
a great
down
story,
anyway.
isn't it?
But you're going to put in more into the Auckland casino. I mean, so there'd be even fewer if it weren't for this deal.
Maybe or maybe not, but all I can tell you is there'll be less than there is today.
How many jobs do you estimate all up that the convention centre would create?
About 800 full-time and part-time, and about 900 constructed.
So there was, the Herald actually did an interesting comparison over the weekend to other convention centres that showed actually a lot fewer full-time staff for greater capacity. So where do your numbers come from?
Yeah, ours are advice from MED, but you've got to remember the Herald used full-time equivalents. They didn't use casual staff. If you have the combination of full-time and casual, comes up to 800. They use a multiplier effect of some order. Again, if you look at Melbourne has about 500 casual staff, as I understand, working in the convention centre.
So you're talking about the jobs that relate directly to the operation of the convention centre
About
and
800.
900 in construction and then build up.
That's advice, I think.
The Melbourne Convention Centre is half owned by a New Zealand investment fund, which you didn't consider as good a bet as Skycity. Can you explain why? I mean, did you ever get any numbers from Lloyd Morrison?
Well, I think when you say you're using that in the royal sense. For a start off, the decision about whether it was decided as a good deal or not was made by MED officials. They looked at all 5 of the particular proposals. They used a series of assessments to make a judgment call, but in the application put in by Infratil, there was no recommendation that they would be putting in any funding, so it would have required 100% government funding.
Did you ever talk to Lloyd Morrison about?
Not from memory, no.
So can you see why that might give the impression that Skycity had the inside running, given that you had discussions with him, but you know, despite Lloyd Morrison, who's a pretty well noted businessman, personally writing to you?
Well, firstly, if in theory we had gone down that route, you'd be making the same claims, wouldn't you? You'd say that because I knew Lloyd Morrison and because he contacted me directly, somehow they got the deal. Secondly, we went through the process of saying that we wanted a convention centre with quite a number of parties. We also said once you put up your best option, but the government's preferred option is not to put in cash. There was only one bid that came in that position, and it was Skycity. And for that reason, it was a much more superior bid to any of the others.
But can you say that categorically, if those other bidders would produce numbers? Because I think this morning you've said that you've just made it clear Skycity were the only ones that came up.
They were the only ones, yeah.
With numbers.
Correct.
But you never saw any numbers from any of the other bidders.
What I saw was I didn't look at all of the bids. I got a recommendation. MED handled that process, went through a full and thorough process across a number of criteria. MED came back with a recommendation and said, look, if you want to build a convention centre, firstly we think this is a superior bid on a number of different categories: location, ability to run it, likely to be successful, etc., but also it doesn't require government funding.
So very clearly, the MED advice to you was go with Skycity.
Oh, absolutely.
The long-term jobs that creates them, from what you're saying, will be casual and most likely low paid, won't they?
I wouldn't accept that. Firstly, I mean, there'll be about 900 jobs of people who construct it, and they're not low paid. As we know, there's a big range there. And as I say, about 800 full-time or casual, there'll be a variety of different things. But, I mean, if you take a step back from that, that is the convention centre. And I think you've got to understand why the government's in this position. That is because it wants a national convention centre that, as I said to you, it captures some of the economic benefit at that convention centre, but not all of it. So I don't know whether you class a 747 or a 777 captain as low paid or unskilled. I don't. But they'll be flying the people in from overseas, landing at Auckland Airport. I don't know if you consider a top chef at a major restaurant to be low paid or unskilled, but I don't. And many of those people will be eating there. In the end, the government wants this for a very clear reason: economic growth and jobs. And this will create 200,000 visitor nights who spend roughly double what the average tourist does at the moment. Now, this is an industry that right back from 2003 has been arguing that a national convention centre is an important piece of infrastructure to grow the tourism sector. As I've said so often last week, there is nothing magical about this, and despite your best efforts, no conspiracy. It's just a simple fact of life that the government wants to see a national convention centre, and this might come as a shock to you, but Bill English doesn't have 350 million to give me to build one.
But do you agree that a convention centre would be a lot further down the track if you weren't having to go through, close to a year's worth of negotiations? I mean, if you had to just sign someone on rather than doing these prolonged negotiations, we would have been a lot further along the track by now.
Well, A, it's important that there's a good deal for the taxpayer, so a thorough process is important. That's what we're going through at the moment. Secondly, let's go back to 2003. Do you know what the surplus was that year? Do you know what it was in 2004, and 2005, and 2006, and 2007? The answer is a lot of money. And in none of those circumstances, despite all of the feasibility study and all of the economic benefits, they were never built. And the simple facts of life are, these things don't make money in isolation. They make money for the overall economy. So yeah, are we being creative looking for a deal? Yes. Is it in Auckland and New Zealand's best interest? Yes. Will there be less poker machines at the end of this transaction over time? Yes.
Why did you stop the business case going ahead?
Well, that was pretty simple. What happened was in 2008, when we got the advice as the incoming minister, we said, yeah, we'll put in some money to a feasibility study. There were a number of partners that put in that money. We put in 50,000 at the end of that. The officials came back and said, as a result of the feasibility study, you should go ahead and build a convention centre. We think it's a good idea. We'll now do your mock business case, if you like. I said, forget about the mock business case. Let's go out and see if anyone's prepared to put up their money.
So there was no connection with Skycity indicating that they were prepared to...
Not despite your wildest conspiracies, John, no.
Who else put up money for the feasibility study?
I can't remember, but I can my office can give you. I think it was Auckland Council and somebody else. There's three partners.
Did all the other potential bidders know that there were law changes on the table that may benefit their business, or was it only Skycity?
Well, to a number of people we said, look, the government doesn't have a lot of money, so we'd have to be creative. Look, there are always options. You could put on a big tax, you could put on a departure tax. All of those things have been considered and looked at. My view is this is probably the best one.
Prime Minister, will the government consider granting asylum for any of the Afghani translators?
Well, I think what we'd say is, obviously we'll look very closely at that situation, as I think all countries would need to. We wouldn't want to leave people who have been integral in the process high and dry or at risk of their lives, but equally we need to have discussions with both our partners and the individuals to assess the merits of their case. I haven't had any advice on that, but I know that the Minister is going to go and look at that situation.
What do you think of this idea from a Health Ministry discussion paper? If you really want to make New Zealand smoke-free by 2020, make cigarette packets $100 a pack.
It sounds like an awful lot. I mean, the government unashamedly has been wanting to increase the price of cigarettes and take a number of other steps to deter people from smoking, including potentially plain packaging and looking at displays, cabinets. And they're all part of an integrated approach to deter people from wanting to smoke. Whether it get to $100 a packet and whether that would be sustainable in terms of the black market, I don't know. It sounds like a big step for me.
What do you make of the US Chamber of Commerce statement that was put out over the weekend raising concerns about New Zealand's move towards introducing plain packaging?
Well, I haven't seen the statement, but I've had some oral conversations with the Minister of Trade, and from memory the things he said to me is that there's nothing in the trade agreements that we currently have that would preclude us from having plain packaging. Certainly in terms of the United States, which is where there's a case currently between Australia, as I'm sure you're aware, we don't have an FTA with the United States. So I haven't had any advice that would support the view that we can't undertake plain packaging.
They seem to believe it undermines intellectual property rights and could affect future trade deals.
Well, I'm sure they're representing the views of their cigarette manufacturers, but whether that's actually correct or not is a very different issue.
So when they, if the casino is up and running in convention centre, how many full-time equivalent jobs will there be?
I think it's about 200 or 300 full-time equivalents and about 500 casual, about 800 jobs as we've said.
You said 800 in full-time and part-time.
Yeah, so that's a total 800. Yeah.
Just going back to, are you confident that you'll get the support from your partners in terms of any legislative changes that are required result instead?
Well, we need to take this through it, but yeah.
Have you, so you don't remember having a conversation yourself with Mr. Banks and Mr. Dunn, have any of your colleagues?
I don't know. I mean, look, I may have had a conversation with them, but I don't recall it. It may have come up in our confidences flow, just general negotiating, because it's been well and truly in the public domain for a long time. It's possible, but I just honestly don't remember it.
Why are you so confident that you'd have their support? If you can't remember discussions, or you haven't had discussions, or haven't indicated to you, is it, are you just taking it for granted that they're sort of lapdogs, if you will?
No, I think because they'll see it as a good deal. I mean, that's what I think most New Zealanders will think. I mean, as I said to your question the other day, I mean, if you could put up a proposal to New Zealanders that will increase the number of tourists by 200,000 a year, create more jobs, have an important piece of infrastructure that's important for the tourism sector, and over time see less pokie machines in New Zealand, I think you'd have universal support.
Well, Minister, on Mahik Bulwiri and the Algerian custody case, that particular minister, Natalie, said that you promised a review.
Yep.
And just wondering if you can tell us where that's at exactly.
I can, if you just give me 1 second, I can tell you exactly the words, but she is, just 1 second. Look, the long and short of it is, I have to find it. The long and short of it is that she is working, as I understand, with the Algerian authorities at the moment around her status and therefore her capacity to be able to argue a custody case.
She's claiming, and her family are claiming that since the initial intervention back in Feb with MFAT official Barbara Weldon,
Yep.
there's been no assistance from the government. Do you think the government will have to pay?
No, I don't think that's true. I mean, MFAT officials have been actively engaged for quite some time, and they've been documented in the papers. I mean, this is, as we've always said, quite a complex situation where basically you've got 2 parents tied up in a custody dispute, with obviously one of them is an Algerian citizen, and now we're trying to apply Algerian law, which is complex as a starting point. So, look, New Zealand officials have been doing everything they can, as best we can, when we're in the middle of a custody dispute.
What do you think about John Anderson's comments on the Greater New Zealand about Australian troops having been bludgers and thieves?
I find them offensive. I mean, you know, we're about to go and commemorate in 2 days' time the Anzac tradition, and while I have enormous respect for the New Zealand forces and support the views at one point they put forward, which is our forces have and continue to be magnificent in the work that they carry out, denigrating the Australians as part of that analysis, I don't think is appropriate.
Do you have a message, Prime Minister, for those Australian soldiers?
Well, I just regret those comments, because you know, I've seen the Australian forces on a number of situations when I've been in places like Afghanistan, when I've seen them in Gallipoli and various other places, and you know, the spirit of the Anzac tradition is alive and well. That was a tradition forged on the battlegrounds in Gallipoli, and to take away from their efforts, I personally find quite offensive.
You talked about how you and other ministers have been overseas and tried to open doors and promote trade. It's been obviously talking about the convention centre, about bringing in more tourists. Last week, Russell Norman got figures and stats about, Statistics New Zealand study looking at still the main issue for exporters and tourism industry is the level of the New Zealand dollar.
Yep.
I mean, but I'm just wondering, is there anything that you can see still that could be done around the dollar that would help exporters and the tourism industry?
Well, firstly, I mean, what the government is doing is trying to take pressure off all manufacturers and exporters through better regulation and better policy, and that certainly helps. So I've always believed we should apply our minds to the things that we can definitely control, and that is business regulation, business tax, all of those issues. Secondly, the big issue, or one of the big issues I think, is that in terms of supporting monetary policy, if we run tight fiscal policy, then we take the pressure off the Reserve Bank, and we're going to have pretty much a zero budget on May 24th, and that's another example of where we're supporting monetary policy by taking the pressure off that. So I think that's all really important. third thing I just sort of say is that there is, while I accept, for non-commodity linked exporters, exchange rate is causing them problems, and we've said for quite some time now, we think the US and New Zealand exchange rate's overvalued. I think it's important to put a bit of perspective around it. The high exchange rate takes pressure off oil prices, and that's quite a big component part. The high exchange rate takes pressure off imported inflation, and that takes pressure off the Reserve Bank. That's important. Many manufactured goods which are exported have an imported component, and again, a higher exchange rate helps that. So it's not all bad news, but it certainly puts pressure on some of them.
So when you said in Indonesia that the government's considering ways to mitigate the risks,
I think you've got to read the whole quote, and the whole quote makes it pretty clear that I don't believe in intervention, never have, and frankly never will.
No,
I've spent my professional life looking at it, and it fails.
but you're meaning the existing government policy.
I'm talking about all the things I just talked about then. If we go out to the area and make sure the RMA works properly, employment legislation works properly, tax law is functioning properly, all those things are things within our control. Dreaming that we can somehow get the exchange rate down through intervention is la-la land stuff.
On the Crater Farms bid, do you have any concerns that Shanghai Pension have registered those two brand names, in particular the Pure 100 brand name?
Look, I hadn't seen that they had registered it. They'll obviously have to make sure they comply with the law. I mean, there have been previous attempts by other people to use 100% pure, and my knowledge of that is that they've been fought and resisted by tourism. So if they were in any way in breach of that, then I'm sure Tourism New Zealand would look at that.
Well, Tourism New Zealand told me that they'd registered the 100% pure brand name for tourism and tourism-related businesses, but it was open to other organisations to register other brands. But Pure 100 is pretty clearly designed to leverage off of New Zealand's international reputation, is it not? And I mean, is that something which you're comfortable with, a Chinese-controlled company using New Zealand's tourism marketing money and the effect of that to actually leverage their commercial business?
Well, tourism haven't tried to close that angle down. It's because they believe that they've properly satisfied any concerns they might have with people that would use it in relation to the tourism sector. There's probably lots of people who use 100% pure in different forms in other industries. I don't know, I haven't looked at it, but I'm sure that's the case. All I can tell you is that they're very protective when it gets to anywhere near the tourism sector and marketing campaigns.
But I mean, in this case, it's a company, and Russell Norman has raised the issue of what happens if there's a scandal, a melamine type scandal involving milk products in China, and that product has got a brand name Pure 100, which associates with New Zealand. Aren't we risking our international branding?
No, I don't think so. I mean, look, there was always that risk, actually, that there was a much bigger issue when Fonterra was the part owner of San Lu, and there was a melamine scandal. Actually, what the international markets did was pretty quickly differentiate between a New Zealand source product and a Chinese source product. And certainly in the case of New Zealand, which is the company you're effectively talking about, as you know, there's 27 conditions sitting around the Crater Farms bid, and one of those includes that they can't be vertically integrated. So the probability of things like a melamine scandal is certainly much, much lower in the New Zealand environment.
You raise the issue of vertical integration. If it can't be vertically integrated, but everyone says that the Chinese interest is more in food security than it is in land ownership. How do those two things sit side by side? How do the Chinese secure food security if they can't control processing of these other things?
Well, you have to go and ask them that.
What's your reading of it?
Well, my view is that the motivations of China wanting to tap into New Zealand's food supply are pretty clear. They're becoming much wealthier. New Zealand product is world class, and the logic behind them wanting to be able to tap into that resource is apparent for anyone. I think they are going to prove to be, probably our most crucial market when it comes to food supply, just the sheer development of that economy.
Do you think that, just to shift the focus a little bit, do you think that the rules around the OIO, the rules that the OIO considers, particularly in terms of that with and without scenario that they look at, do you think they need addressing? Because reading through the report they issued last week, they were taking into account things like Shanghai Pension's promises over the environment and over Maori Waikato and that kind of stuff. Well, it's hard. You could hardly do a with and without analysis of those because there's no New Zealand bidder who's promising to do that and no requirement on them to do it.
Yep. So I'm not a lawyer and just catch my comments in that regard, but I think if you go and look at Justice Miller's ruling, what he actually says when he says you look at the with and without, is he also is quite clear that it's not a requirement, one assumes, he says of ministers, but one assumes that also means the OIO, to actually model that counterfactual bid. He says you just have to consider what that counterfactual bid might be. It's not specific. That's my understanding of it anyway. In terms of the overall legislation, look, there's always a degree of judgment in there. The OIO and ministers are required to make an assessment across a lot of different categories, and I think they've done their best to assess that given the information that they have. It's not perfect, but it's as good as it can be.
So would that lack of specificity in that High Court ruling really allow the commission application to proceed? Because you could say, in good faith, yes, we had considered that, being on we go. So
no, I'm just saying,
too much difference?
What is a little bit different is that the before and after test is reasonably easy to quantify. The with or without test asks you to consider a notional counterfactual bid which actually isn't there, and how you construct that bid. The judge in his ruling says it's actually not a necessary ingredient to actually go and spell all of that out. Now, quite how you assess that is for others to look at, not me.
I mean, there was a comment around this bit about whether there would have been as much public interest if it had been a Chinese bid, because obviously we've had German and Swiss interest buying dairy farms and Southland, etc. But if there's a strategic sense that China's really looking to get into the dairy industry here, I mean, would that create a bit of a worry if there was a real Chinese demand to buy a whole lot more time?
Well, look, I think my own view is that we'd welcome Chinese investment in New Zealand just like we would welcome investment from a number of countries. But personally, I'd rather channel that investment into processing and moving up the value chain. I think a straight transfer of selling huge tracts of New Zealand land isn't overly in our interest. My main point has been I don't think that's actually happening at this point. I mean, if you go back to about, I think it's 2005 or 2006, there's been over 800,000 hectares of land sold. And prior to the Crayford Farms sale to Shanghai Pingjin, there had been 223 hectares sold. So I think, it's more a perception than a reality. Now, if that perception turned into reality, the government might want to go back and address that position, but that's not what we're currently facing.
Do you think people might be more concerned about China than opposed to, say, Germany or Switzerland and those types of purchases? Because China is, as you say, has a massive population, is developing, and may well be a country that needs food security as opposed to the other ones. So, people are a bit worried about their motivations in comparison to those other countries.
Well, I think what is true, if you look at China as their capacity to buy substantial amounts of land or to invest anyway is unquestioned, when they have nearly $4 trillion in reserves, and they clearly have a strong motivation in terms of 1.5 billion people in their country. So they've got a lot of interest. But I don't think that is going to convert to massive sales of land to Chinese buyers. And all the government said the whole way through this process is we just need to be consistent. If we think that there's too much land being sold to foreigners, irrelevant of their ethnicity, then the government may look to tighten up the rules. At this point, because we've been selling at a much slower rate than Labour was, I think you've got to argue we're probably in reasonable shape. If that dynamic changes, then the government reserves the right to do it.
The Chinese embassy itself said there are a lot of Chinese investors looking at this application, and basically, if it gets the go-ahead, it's going to pique the interest of a whole, a lot of other investors. So, pressure may well increase, demand may well increase, and is that the scenario you're talking about? But if it gets to that stage, I mean, they've said themselves, it'll, probably spur quite a lot of interest in New Zealand land.
Well, I think let's see. I think what the Chinese would have been looking for is consistency. And if the answer was no in the Crayford Farms deal, I think they'd be totally comfortable with that, as long as the answer would be no for any foreign buyer. Whether the fact that some people might be looking at that deal means they're necessarily going to go and buy land is a very different issue. But maybe they were just looking at the way we might assess foreign investment. For instance, when Labour turned down the Canadian pension plan deal to buy into Auckland airports, there was a lot of commentary in the business media that really deterred investment in New Zealand, because there was a very unclear picture of whether foreign investment was welcome. It didn't mean it was all going to go into airports. So I don't think you can necessarily join the dots. It all means it's going to go into land.
The MED paper that was released last week talks of countries other than China, investors who'd be looking askance at the delays or whatever else, and have been holding back on investments. It doesn't actually list those, but are you aware of any companies from overseas that have been holding back on investments?
Is that the MFAT letter from Murray McCulley to Morris Williams?
There's a paper attached to it.
Yeah, okay, sure. Look, I haven't had extensive conversations with them about that. I'm sure there were lots of people around the world looking at this. I mean, I think within New Zealand there'll be a lot of people looking to see how the OIO and government handles this. I mean, ultimately when you get a landmark ruling, as we got from Justice Miller, then lots of people will take, passing interest in that, see what it might mean. Okay.
Wasn't Peter for 10% discount for algae on the winter power prices in this year's budget? Have you got any chance of doing that?
In a word, no. I mean, look, if you go and have a look at what we've done, I can tell you exactly. We have, in time that we've been in office, essentially from 1 April 2008, so slightly before we came in, to now, if you count the increase that's going to go through on 1 April 2012, increased the pension by $194 per couple per fortnight. That's an increase of 22%. So I'll be the first to acknowledge there'll be some pensioners that find it difficult to pay the power bill, but I think the government's been doing a good job of trying to get New Zealand super up. Secondly, Winston Peters was part of a government that saw energy prices rise by 72% over the period that Labour were in office, some period of which they were with Winston Peters. And the entire time Winston Peters was with that Labour government, I don't recall him ever giving pensioners a 10% reduction in their power bills. So maybe he owes an apology for what he did in terms of supporting Labour back from 2005 to 2008, and I look forward to hearing the apology.
Increasing